July 22nd, 1991, a night that would expose one of the most horrific secrets in American history. Inside this unassuming apartment building, a man sat in silence, surrounded by the evidence of unspeakable acts. But this wasn't just another crime scene. What police would discover here would shock even the most hardened investigators and leave a scar on the nation's collective psyche. Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that has become synonymous with evil. But beyond the headlines, beyond the courtroom drama, lies a deeper question. What really happened to this man? What drove him to commit such monstrous acts? And how did his life take such a dark and chilling turn? Welcome to CrimeByte, the channel where we delve into the darkest corners of true crime. From chilling cold cases to the most infamous criminals in history, we bring you stories that will captivate, shock, and make you question the world around you. If you're drawn to the untold truths and the unsettling mysteries of human behavior, you're in the right place. Today, we unravel the haunting tale of Jeffrey Dahmer, from the depths of his troubled childhood to the final, shocking moments of his life. This is not just a story of crime. This is a story of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. Let's begin. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. At first glance, his childhood seemed ordinary. But beneath the surface, cracks in the foundation of his life were forming. Cracks that would eventually widen into chasms. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, an intellectual man whose career often took him away from home. His mother, Joyce, struggled with mental health issues, including anxiety and depression, which led to erratic behavior and frequent arguments. Their household was tense, filled with long silences and sudden outbursts, creating an environment that left a lasting impact on their eldest son. "I didn't realize it at the time," Lionel once said, but Jeffrey was retreating into himself. He stopped talking to us, stopped sharing what was on his mind, and I suppose I was too preoccupied to notice. As a child, Jeffrey showed an unusual interest in the macabre. His fascination began innocently enough, collecting bugs and small animal bones he found in the yard. But by the time he was 10, this hobby had escalated. He began dissecting roadkill and preserving the remains in jars, a gruesome precursor to the horrors he would later commit. His classmates described him as quiet and awkward, a boy who preferred to sit alone in the cafeteria or roam the woods by himself after school. Yet, despite his isolation, Jeffrey developed a talent for masking his true self. In high school, he became known for his offbeat sense of humor and bizarre pranks, earning him fleeting attention and laughter from his peers. But even then, his darker impulses were beginning to take hold. He started drinking heavily, sometimes even bringing alcohol to school in hidden flasks. His classmates chalked it up to teenage rebellion, unaware that for Jeffrey, it was a way to drown out the unsettling fantasies that plagued his mind. As his family life deteriorated, culminating in his parents' divorce when he was 18, Jeffrey found himself alone in a house that had once been filled with arguments and tension. Now it was silent, too silent. It was during this time, in the summer of 1978, that Jeffrey committed his first murder. Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker who had been looking for a ride to a concert, would never make it to his destination. Jeffrey lured him back to the house under the pretense of drinking together. When Stephen tried to leave, Jeffrey panicked, hitting him over the head with a dumbbell. He later dismembered the body and scattered the remains in the woods surrounding the house. It was a crime born of impulse, but executed with chilling precision. After his first murder, Jeffrey Dahmer spent nearly a decade trying to suppress his urges. He enlisted in the army, but was discharged due to alcohol abuse. He attempted to live a normal life, holding down various jobs and even attending college briefly. But the darkness within him continued to grow, gnawing at the edges of his existence. By the time he moved into the infamous apartment on North 25th Street, Jeffrey had embraced his impulses fully. Between 1987 and 1991, he lured 16 more victims to their deaths. His methods were calculated, his demeanor disarming. Jeffrey would approach his victims, often young men at bars or bus stops, and invite them back to his apartment with promises of money, alcohol, or companionship. Once inside his apartment, the victims would often be drugged before Jeffrey carried out his horrific acts. What set his crimes apart was not just their brutality, but their ritualistic nature. Jeffrey was not simply killing, he was preserving, consuming, and attempting to keep his victims in ways that defy comprehension. Inside his apartment, police found an array of tools and remains, severed heads stored in the refrigerator, photographs of dismembered bodies, and human hearts preserved in a freezer. Jeffrey later admitted to cannibalism, stating that consuming his victims made them a part of him forever. Neighbors had long complained about strange smells and noises emanating from his unit, but their concerns were dismissed. The most chilling part, on several occasions, Jeffrey narrowly avoided detection. In one infamous incident, a 14-year-old boy named Konarak Synthasamphone escaped from Dahmer's apartment, only to be returned by police, who believed Jeffrey's explanation that they were lovers having a dispute. "I told them something wasn't right," one neighbor said. But they didn't listen. They never listened. By the time Jeffrey Dahmer was finally caught in 1991, the world was horrified by the extent of his crimes. His arrest and subsequent confessions revealed a level of depravity that defied understanding. But what drove Jeffrey Dahmer to commit such atrocities? Was it nature or nurture? A broken mind or pure evil? These questions would haunt investigators, psychologists, and the public for years to come. On the evening of July 22, 1991, the nightmare that had gripped Milwaukee was finally uncovered, not through careful police work or an investigative breakthrough, but by sheer chance and the bravery of one man, Tracy Edwards. Jeffrey Dahmer had approached Tracy earlier that evening at a bar, offering him $100 to pose for photographs. It was a tactic Dahmer had used countless times before, one that had lured unsuspecting men into his deadly trap. But Tracy Edwards' story would unfold differently. As Tracy stepped into apartment 213, the smell hit him first, a nauseating combination of decay and chemicals. The sparsely decorated living room had a strange vibe, with a small TV playing The Exorcist 3 and photographs of male torsos scattered on a table. Dahmer handed Tracy a drink, urging him to relax, but Tracy was on edge. "I noticed the locks on the doors," Tracy would later recall. "Something wasn't right. He was acting strange, like he was in a trance." Jeffrey's calm demeanor shifted abruptly. Without warning, he pulled out handcuffs and attempted to restrain Tracy, who managed to resist being fully secured. As Jeffrey paced back and forth, mumbling about his need for control, Tracy's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. "He kept saying he wanted to eat my heart," Tracy testified later. "I knew I had to find a way out of there." In a split-second decision, Tracy pretended to comply with Jeffrey's demands, waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came when Jeffrey briefly let his guard down, stepping into another room. Tracy struck him, bolted out the door, and ran down the street, still partially handcuffed. When Tracy flagged down two officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, he frantically explained what had happened. He urged them to come back to the apartment with him. Initially skeptical, the officers decided to investigate, unaware that they were about to walk into one of the most infamous crime scenes in history. As the officers stepped into apartment 213, they were met with the same overpowering smell that Tracy had described. At first, Dahmer appeared cooperative, even calm, explaining that the handcuffs were part of a misunderstanding. But when Officer Mueller entered the bedroom, the facade began to crumble. On a small dresser, Mueller spotted a stack of Polaroid photographs. He began flipping through them, and his initial confusion turned to horror. The images depicted dismembered bodies, some posed in grotesque positions. They were too vivid, too detailed to be anything but real. "These are real," Mueller reportedly said to his partner as he turned to face Dahmer. "This is no joke." At that moment, Dahmer realized the game was up. He attempted to flee, but the officers subdued him, handcuffing him as they radioed for backup. What followed was the beginning of an investigation that would horrify even the most seasoned detectives. As investigators began combing through Dahmer's apartment, they uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror. In the refrigerator, they found severed heads and organs, carefully preserved. In a large freezer, they discovered human hearts and other body parts, wrapped in plastic. The most disturbing items, however, were the tools and evidence of Dahmer's methods. Investigators found saws, knives, and a drum filled with acid used to dissolve his victims' remains. The walls were lined with Polaroid photographs documenting each stage of his gruesome process. Detective Patrick Kennedy, who was present during the search, later described the experience. It was like something out of a nightmare. You couldn't believe a human being was capable of such things. But Dahmer's meticulous documentation wasn't just for his own gratification. It was part of a disturbing ritual. By preserving parts of his victims and photographing their remains, Dahmer claimed he was attempting to keep them with him forever. Word of Dahmer's arrest spread quickly, and the media descended upon the scene. Neighbors watched in shock as investigators carried evidence out of the apartment, including human remains. For many, it was incomprehensible that such horrors had been happening right under their noses. When interrogated, Dahmer initially denied everything. But as the evidence mounted, he began to open up, providing investigators with chillingly detailed confessions. Over the course of several weeks, Dahmer described each of his 17 murders in graphic detail, showing no visible remorse. "I didn't want them to leave," he explained when asked why he killed his victims. "I wanted to keep them with me. I wanted them to be a part of me." Dahmer's confession was both shocking and revealing. He admitted to cannibalism, necrophilia, and attempting to create zombies by injecting acid into his victims' brains. These admissions painted a picture of a man driven by dark compulsions, yet disturbingly calculated in his actions. As details of Dahmer's crimes were made public, the reaction was swift and visceral. Families of the victims were devastated, demanding answers about how such atrocities could have gone unnoticed for so long. Activists criticized law enforcement for missed opportunities, pointing to incidents like the return of Konarak synthesamphone to Dahmer's apartment just months earlier. The broader public was both horrified and fascinated. True crime enthusiasts and media outlets delved into Dahmer's background, searching for clues about what could have driven him to commit such unspeakable acts. Books, documentaries, and talk shows debated whether Dahmer was born a monster or shaped by his environment. Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest marked the beginning of a legal and psychological examination that would captivate the world. But even as investigators pieced together the details of his crimes, one question loomed large. Was Jeffrey Dahmer a man in control of his actions, or was he a victim of his own dark impulses? Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began on January 30th, 1992, less than a year after his horrifying crimes came to light. By then, the entire world knew his name, and his face had become synonymous with evil. But the question dominating headlines wasn't whether Dahmer had committed the crimes. He had already confessed in chilling detail. It was whether he was sane enough to be held fully accountable for his actions. Dahmer was charged with 17 counts of murder, one for each of his victims. His defense team, led by attorney Gerald Boyle, entered a plea of guilty but insane. This plea would determine the course of the trial, as the defense argued that Dahmer's crimes were driven by severe mental illness, not rational intent. In contrast, the prosecution sought to prove that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions and had carefully planned each murder. Lead prosecutor E. Michael McCann emphasized the methodical nature of Dahmer's crimes, painting a picture of a man who not only knew what he was doing, but took deliberate steps to avoid getting caught. "This is not the work of a madman," McCann said. "This is the work of a cold, calculating individual who knew exactly what he was doing." The trial was a spectacle, with every detail of Dahmer's gruesome acts laid bare for the jury and the world to hear. Witnesses included police officers, forensic experts, and even Tracy Edwards, the man whose escape led to Dahmer's capture. Tracy recounted his harrowing experience in vivid detail, his voice shaking as he described how close he had come to becoming another victim. "For a moment, I thought I wasn't going to make it out alive," Tracy said on the stand. "I could see the look in his eyes. He wasn't just going to hurt me. The prosecution presented the Polaroid photographs taken by Dahmer, the preserved remains found in his apartment, and forensic evidence linking him to the murders. Each piece of evidence served as a chilling reminder of the horrors Dahmer had inflicted on his victims. The defense's argument hinged on Dahmer's mental state. Boyle called psychologists and psychiatrists to testify, each presenting a portrait of a deeply disturbed individual. They described Dahmer's obsessive fantasies of control and possession, his inability to form normal relationships, and his growing compulsion to act on his darkest urges. One expert testified that Dahmer's crimes stemmed from a profound sense of isolation and a desperate need for connection. In his mind, consuming his victims wasn't about cruelty, the expert explained. It was about keeping them with him forever. Despite these arguments, the defense faced an uphill battle. Prosecutors pointed out that Dahmer had taken elaborate steps to avoid detection, such as drugging his victims, dismembering their bodies, and disposing of remains in a manner designed to minimize suspicion. These actions, they argued, showed a clear understanding of right and wrong. Dahmer's own words. Perhaps the most haunting moment of the trial came when Dahmer himself spoke. In a rare display of emotion, he apologized to the families of his victims, admitting the full extent of his guilt. "I know what I did was wrong," he said. "I know I hurt so many people. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. All I can do is pray for forgiveness." While some families accepted his apology, others viewed it as too little, too late. "You destroyed my life," one grieving mother said during her victim impact statement. "I will never forgive you for what you did to my son." After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty on all 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, amounting to 957 years in prison. The insanity defense had failed. The jury agreed with prosecutors that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. In Ohio, Dahmer later pled guilty to the murder of Stephen Hicks, his first victim, adding another life sentence to his already staggering total. Yet for many, the verdict offered little solace. The families of the victims would forever carry the pain of their loss, and the world struggled to make sense of the atrocities Dahmer had committed. The trial sparked a national conversation about mental health, policing failures, and the broader societal factors that allowed Dahmer to go undetected for so long. Activists pointed to systemic racism and homophobia, noting that many of Dahmer's victims were young men of color whose disappearances had not been taken seriously by law enforcement. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial may have ended with a clear verdict, but it left behind a host of unanswered questions. Was Dahmer truly a product of his environment, or was he simply born evil? Could his crimes have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier? These questions would haunt not only the families of his victims, but an entire generation of true crime enthusiasts. After his sentencing in 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer began serving 15 consecutive life sentences at Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. For many, the knowledge that Dahmer would spend the rest of his life behind bars provided some semblance of justice. But life in prison was anything but simple for the man dubbed the Milwaukee Cannibal. Dahmer entered the prison system under heavy security. His notoriety made him a target not only for other inmates, but also for public scrutiny. Prison officials initially placed him in protective custody, isolating him from the general population to ensure his safety. For months, Dahmer lived in near total isolation. His meals were delivered through a slot in the door, and his interactions were limited to brief conversations with guards. While he later described this period as peaceful compared to the chaos of his life outside, it was also in one interview Dahmer stated introspection. "I think about what I did every single day. I wish I could take it all back, but I know I can't. This is my punishment, and I accept it." Over time, Dahmer requested to be integrated into the general prison population. Despite concerns from officials, he argued that he wanted to live like everyone else and face whatever consequences might come his way. During his time in prison, Dahmer claimed to have experienced a religious awakening. He began studying the Bible and was eventually baptized by Minister Roy Ratcliffe in a small prison whirlpool. This act sparked a media frenzy, with many questioning the sincerity of Dahmer's conversion. Ratcliffe, however, defended Dahmer's faith. He showed genuine remorse, the minister said. He wanted to understand God's forgiveness, even though he knew the world would never forgive him. When Dahmer was finally moved to the general population, he quickly became a polarizing figure. Some inmates avoided him entirely, disgusted by the nature of his crimes. Others saw him as an opportunity to gain notoriety themselves. Dahmer's calm demeanor and dark sense of humor often unnerved those around him. He reportedly joked about his crimes, shaping his food into body parts and covering them in ketchup to resemble blood. While some guards found this behavior disturbing, others believed it was Dahmer's way of coping with the reality of his situation. Inmate Christopher Scarver, who would later play a pivotal role in Dahmer's story, described him as arrogant and unrepentant. Scarver claimed that Dahmer's behavior often provoked others, making him a target for retaliation. Despite the tension, Dahmer adhered to a strict routine. He worked in the prison's cleaning detail, scrubbing floors and bathrooms, and spent much of his free time reading or corresponding with people who wrote to him. Remarkably, Dahmer received dozens of letters from curious strangers, true crime enthusiasts, and even fans. Some letters expressed sympathy, while others offered money or sought to understand the mind of a killer. Dahmer rarely responded, but reportedly kept many of the letters, fascinated by the attention he continued to receive. Life in prison came with constant danger. Dahmer was attacked multiple times during his incarceration. In one incident, an inmate attempted to slash his throat with a makeshift knife while Dahmer was attending chapel. Although he survived the attack, the incident highlighted the precariousness of his existence behind bars. Dahmer seemed almost indifferent to the threats against him. In an interview, he stated, "I deserve whatever happens to me. If someone takes my life, that's just part of my punishment." The story of Jeffrey Dahmer came to an abrupt and violent end on the morning of November 28, 1994. On that day, Dahmer, along with two other inmates, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson, was assigned to a cleaning detail in the prison gymnasium. What began as a routine task quickly escalated into a deadly confrontation. Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate serving a life sentence for murder, had long harbored resentment toward Dahmer. Scarver later claimed that he was disturbed by Dahmer's crimes and behavior in prison, describing him as mocking and disrespectful. According to reports, the three men were left unsupervised for approximately 20 minutes. During this time, Scarver retrieved a metal bar from the gym equipment and attacked Dahmer without warning. He struck Dahmer repeatedly in the head and face, inflicting fatal injuries. Scarver then turned on Jesse Anderson, who had also been convicted of heinous crimes, beating him to death as well. After the attack, Scarver calmly returned to his cell and informed guards of what he had done. "God told me to do it," he later claimed. Scarver expressed no remorse for his actions, insisting that he had delivered justice on behalf of Dahmer's victims and their families. While some viewed Scarver's actions as vigilante justice, others criticized the prison system for its failure to protect Dahmer, despite the high-profile nature of his case. News of Dahmer's death spread quickly, reigniting public fascination with his case. For some, his violent end was seen as poetic justice, a fitting conclusion to a life defined by violence. For others, it was a missed opportunity to study Dahmer's psyche and potentially learn from his crimes. "I'm glad he's gone," one woman said. "He didn't deserve to live after what he did." Another added, "I wanted him to rot in prison." Death was too easy for him. For the families of Dahmer's victims, his death brought mixed emotions. Some expressed relief, believing that his death marked the end of a painful chapter. Others felt robbed of the chance to see Dahmer to think about what he did every single day for the rest of his life, said one grieving parent. "Now he's gone, and we're left with the pain." Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes left an indelible mark on history, not just because of their brutality, but because of what they revealed about society's failings. Over the decades since his death, Dahmer's name has become synonymous with evil, but his legacy extends far beyond his actions. Dahmer's case remains one of the most studied in true crime history. His story has inspired countless documentaries, books, movies, and even television series. Each portrayal has sought to explore the complex interplay of factors that led to his crimes, his troubled upbringing, his psychological makeup, and the societal conditions that allowed him to evade detection for so long. But this cultural fascination has sparked ethical debates. Many argue that the media's focus on Dahmer overshadows the stories of his victims, reducing them to mere footnotes in his narrative. This has led to renewed efforts to center the victims' lives in discussions about Dahmer's crimes. Dahmer's legacy also underscores the systemic failures that enabled his killing spree. From police negligence to the marginalization of his victims, many of whom were young men of color or members of the LGBTQ+ community, his case highlights the deep flaws in law enforcement and societal attitudes of the time. In 1991, the return of 14-year-old Konarak Synthesum phone to Dahmer's apartment by police officers sparked outrage. It became a symbol of the systemic racism and homophobia that allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes. The officers involved were initially suspended, but later reinstated, further deepening public mistrust. While much of the attention has focused on Dahmer, the families of his victims have fought to keep their loved ones' memories alive. Community efforts have led to the creation of memorials and initiatives aimed at honoring the victims' lives rather than glorifying their killer. We want people to remember their humanity, their dreams, their families, said one victim's family member. They were more than just victims of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer's case also marked a turning point in the public's relationship with true crime. It fueled a wave of media interest that blurred the lines between information and entertainment. Today, true crime podcasts, shows, and books continue to explore his story, often walking a fine line between education and sensationalism. This raises an important question. What is the responsibility of those who tell these stories? Are we preserving history, seeking justice, or exploiting tragedy for entertainment? Dahmer's legacy is a complex tapestry of horror, fascination, and lessons learned. While his actions shocked the world, they also forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about society, justice, and human nature. His story is not one to glorify, but one to learn from, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the darkest chapters in true crime history. At CrimeByte, we believe in shining a light on the stories that matter, not to glorify the perpetrators, but to honor the victims and seek understanding. What are your thoughts on Jeffrey Dahmer's story? Do you think justice was served, or are there lessons still to be learned? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this episode compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. And remember, every time you share and engage, you help bring attention to these important stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, justice is not just about punishment, it's about understanding, healing, and change.